Howdy. You're watching The Last Climb. Today I'll tell you about a climbing couple who had spent their lives proving they were strong enough for almost anything, until Everest showed them that there's one kind of strength that does not matter above 26,000 feet. They had 30 years of experience behind them and every reason to be confident, but somewhere near the top, Everest was about to teach them one of the most brutal lessons a mountain has ever given. It was the 21st of May, 2017, high on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. Above the last camp and deep in the thin air, climbers call the death zone, where a married couple from Bozeman, Montana, who had spent 2 years telling the world that bottled oxygen and personal climbing Sherpas were a kind of cheating, finally met the one part of that mountain that has never cared how good anyone is. By the time the sun went down that day, the argument they had come to win was over, and it had not gone the way they promised their followers it would. Their names were Dean Ridley, who was 54, and Delia Ridley, who was 51. And they had been married for 26 years and roped together for almost all of them. They lived outside Bozeman, Montana, and the first thing anyone who knew them will tell you is that they were the real thing. These were not weekend tourists who had bought their way onto a mountain. Between them, they had put up hard new routes in the Alps, survived storms high in the Alaska range, and turned back within sight of summits in Patagonia when the weather told them to. The kind of cold, technical climbing that kills people who are merely good and rewards only the excellent, and they had survived it for 3 decades. They had built a modest but devoted following around a simple and truly old idea in climbing: the belief that a mountain should be met by fair means, under your own power, without bottled oxygen, using the fixed ropes only where the standard route left, no alternative, and without a paid crew carrying your loads and your risk. In the purest corners of the sport, that idea is respected, and Dean and Delia held it like a faith. People who climbed with them describe a couple who were generous, funny, and almost frighteningly calm on dangerous ground, the sort you trusted with your life on a wall in a storm. The trouble was not their skill, which was real, and it was not their courage, which was real too. The trouble was that somewhere along the way their creed had curdled into contempt, and they had started to believe that the crowds on the ordinary Everest, the veterans who guided them, and even the Sherpas who made it all possible, were beneath them. It is a small and human failing, the way being very good at one hard thing can quietly convince a person they are above being taught anything, and on most mountains it would have cost them nothing. Everest is not most mountains. You can still find the way they talked about it in the 2 years before they went, because they were proud of the argument and they made it loudly. In several posts, they described the standard Everest as a conga line of tourists dragged up a fixed rope, breathing air out of a bottle so their bodies never had to earn the height. There is a video where Dean calls supplemental oxygen a lie that turns a great mountain into a theme park ride, and another where Delia reads a veteran guide's safety warning out loud in a mocking voice for the camera. They singled out one man in particular, a weathered Norwegian guide named Kurt Rustad, who had guided on Everest for nearly 2 decades, and dismissed him in a clip that circulated in a few climbing forums as a commercial guide who had long since stopped truly climbing, a man selling summits rather than earning them. In the weeks before they left, they laid out their plan as a kind of protest, a statement that the mountain could still be met honestly if only people had the nerve, and a small but loyal climbing audience cheered them on for it. It made them popular in a certain corner of the sport, the ones who like their heroes proud and their mountains conquered. Watching all of it now, knowing exactly what the mountain was quietly waiting to teach them, is a strange and heavy thing. Everest does not care how good you are on rock and ice, and I have watched it take that lesson to climbers far more gifted than the tourists these two love to mock. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what actually kills people on Everest, because it is almost never the climbing. The standard route up the southeast ridge is not technically hard by the standards of the walls Dean and Delia had spent their lives on. What makes Everest lethal is the altitude itself. The simple fact that above about 26,000 feet, in the zone climbers grimly call the death zone, there is so little oxygen that the human body begins to fail, no matter how fit or skilled it is. The brain can swell, the lungs can fill with fluid, judgment rots, and every hour spent up there is an hour closer to not coming back. This is the whole reason bottled oxygen exists. Not to make the summit easy, but to keep a climber alive long enough to get back down. And the reason experienced teams hire strong Sherpas and set turnaround times they do not break. Climbing Everest without oxygen has been done by a rare few, the greatest high-altitude climbers in history. And even for them, it sits right at the edge of what a person can survive, with a death rate that dwarfs the ordinary route. The cold truth of the place is that the summit is only the halfway point, and that most people who lose their lives on Everest do so on the way down, empty and slow and out of time. Bottled oxygen and a strong support team do not remove that danger, but they blunt it, buying the time and the clear head a tired climber needs to keep moving downhill. The veterans understood all of this in their bones, not as theory but as friends they had lost. Dean and Delia understood the climbing better than most of those veterans, and the altitude not nearly as well as they believed. They had climbed things that would frighten most of us just to look at a photograph of. And I want you to hold on to that because it is exactly what makes this story so hard to explain. At base camp that spring, the warnings came from every direction, and by every account, the couple waved them all away. Kurt Rustad, the veteran they had ridiculed by name, told them once, plainly, that going without oxygen, with no personal Sherpa support up high, and no reserve of bottled air for the way down, in the marginal window they were eyeing, was not a bold statement but a lethal gamble, and that the bottled air and the support they sneered at were the only reasons most people ever came down, and then he left them to it. The senior climbing Sherpas said the same, in fewer words. A seasoned Sirdar named Kairing, who had been high on that mountain dozens of times, warned them that the death zone does not hold debates and does not reward pride, and that he had helped carry down people every bit as strong as they were. He had no reason to lie to them and nothing to sell them, and they dismissed him all the same. According to the people who were there, Dean and Delia heard all of it as the same thing, the self-interest of a guiding industry protecting its business, and they said so at length, and they went back to their tent to prepare. One climber who shared a meal with them that week said the strangest part was how likable they were about it, sure and warm at the same time, as though they truly could not conceive the concern was real. It is worth being fair to them here. They were not stupid, and they were not cowards, and they were not chasing clout in the empty way so many are. They had spent so many years being right about climbing, and being told they were right, that they had lost the ability to imagine being badly wrong about anything close to it. Oxygen was the whole argument for them, the thing they mocked other people for leaning on, and I need you to sit with what it really does up there before you judge how this ends. They did it their way, and for a long time, their way worked, which is part of what makes the story so hard. They acclimatized carefully on their own schedule, they moved beautifully on the mountain, and other climbers who saw them on the lower slopes described a couple who plainly knew exactly what they were doing, faster and cleaner than most of the guided clients around them. They carried no bottled oxygen. They still relied on the basic scaffolding that no one on that mountain can avoid. The permits, the base camp, and the route through the shifting icefall that the icefall doctors rebuild every season. A standard line that exists at all only because rope fixing teams put it there first. But from the high camp upward they climbed independently, without bottled air and without personal climbing Sherpa support above base camp. And they made no secret, even high on the mountain, of how little they thought of the circus around them. They chose a summit day at the edge of a short weather window that the veteran guides considered marginal, with the jet stream forecast to slide back toward the summit and the winds expected to rise, exactly the window Kurt had openly urged them not to use reasoning, as strong alpinists do, that speed and skill would keep them ahead of the risk. It was, in fairness, exactly the kind of calculated gamble that had carried them up harder mountains, where moving fast and light is often safer than moving slow and heavy. The flaw was that those mountains had never asked them to keep functioning for hours in air too thin to think in. On the way up, that reasoning held. They were competent in 100 small ways that lesser climbers are not, efficient with their gear, sure on their feet, reading the ground and the weather with the ease of people who had done it for 30 years. If the mountain were only a climbing problem, they would have solved it the way they had solved so many harder ones. But the mountain is not only a climbing problem. The part that is not, the slow starvation of the body at altitude, does not care how elegantly a person moves, and it was already waiting for them higher up, patient and entirely indifferent to how good they were. Much of what came next is known because the couple filmed themselves, as they always had, and one of their small action cameras was recovered during the later body recovery operation, its memory card still readable. The timestamps and the images fixed the shape of the day, the timing and the places and the pace and the sound of their voices, but a camera can only show so much, and it cannot show what was happening inside their bodies or what the two of them understood. There is Dean near the summit ridge in the flat gray light before dawn, breathing hard, giving the camera the same argument he always gave, that the air up here is honest and everyone else is faking it. There is Delia a little higher and a little later, her words slower and thicker than in the clips from lower down, the sentences not quite finishing. There is a summit clip, time stamped well past the hour the veterans would have called a hard turnaround. The two of them together on top of the world with nothing above them, and it is truly a moment of triumph. And then the clips grow short and strange and far apart on the way down, and the timestamps between them stretch, and after a certain point on the descent, there is no more footage at all. It hit me like a truck when Thermal Lance commented that Sherpas must have a VIP waiting room in the afterlife, and I think every one of you watching will feel that too, because you are about to meet one who earned it in a way I'll never forget. From what the other climbers pieced together afterward, they reached the summit at about 1:30 in the afternoon, hours later than any guide would have set as a hard turnaround, and the summit was never the danger. The danger was the long way down, in the thin air, with the afternoon burning away and no reserve of bottled oxygen to steady them, on legs that had already spent everything on the way up. This is the exact trap the death zone sets, and it is the reason the turnaround time the veterans preach is not timidity but arithmetic. Somewhere on the descent from the summit, on the high, exposed ground below the top, one of them began to fail in the way that altitude makes people fail. The slow, stumbling unsteadiness, the fumbled clip, the delayed answer, the small errors of a brain starved of oxygen that experienced climbers dread more than any storm, though the evidence suggests the first subtle signs had most likely begun well before they reached the top. Climbers who passed them on their own descent later described the couple moving slower and slower, then stopping, one of them clearly in serious trouble and the other refusing to leave. That refusal to leave is the detail that has stayed with the people who saw it, because it was the same partnership that had kept them alive for 3 decades, and up there it worked against them. What no one who passed them could do was carry 2 failing adults down through the death zone, because at that altitude, a strong climber can barely carry themselves, let alone another person, and every minute spent trying is a minute stolen from their own descent. This is the quiet horror the veterans had tried to describe, that help is barely possible up there, and that the only real rescue is the one you never need because you turned around in time. Veterans of that mountain are not the soft establishment these two decided that they were. Whatever they told themselves, and I think this is the hardest proof of that I have ever put in front of you. It was Chiring, the senior climbing Sherpa the couple had lumped in with everything they despised, who did the most to try to save them. While descending with his own team, he came upon the couple below the summit, and he sent his clients on down with another Sherpa before staying behind, and by his account and those of others nearby, he did the one thing that might have mattered, which was to fit the mask from a partially full emergency cylinder his team had been carrying over the face of the climber who was worse off, the very bottled air the two of them had spent 2 years mocking. He and a handful of others tried to get them moving, to clip them to the fixed line and coax them into walking, and gave up their own thin margins of safety to do it. But the couple had no supplemental oxygen cached for their own descent, no reserve to fall back on, and they were 2, not 1, and the afternoon was gone. There is a cruel and simple mathematics to a rescue in the death zone, and it had already turned against everyone on that slope. Chiring stayed longer than was safe for himself, working in the cold and the failing light with hands that would pay for it later. But there is a hard limit to what one person can do at that height, and the couple were beyond the point where oxygen and willing hands could turn things around. In the end, the mountain left him the same impossible choice it has left so many Sherpas before, to stay with people he could not save and be lost too, or to go down alone and live. He went down. By all accounts, he did far more than duty asked, and by his own account, it has never once felt like enough. Skills get you up the hard parts, and I wish more than anything that I could tell you skill has ever once talked the death zone out of keeping someone who stayed too long. It is worth being clear about what was happening to their bodies, because it is the whole answer to the argument they came to make. Without supplemental oxygen, at that height, the low oxygen and the extreme altitude can trigger swelling in the brain, fluid building in the lungs, or both, the conditions known as cerebral and pulmonary edema. And among the first things to deteriorate is the judgment a person would need to save themselves. Fitness does not stop it. Skill does not stop it. 30 years of brilliant climbing does not stop it either. The treatment is immediate descent with supplemental oxygen wherever it is available, and by the time the worst of it takes hold, a climber is often already past being able to get down under their own power, which is the whole reason it kills so quietly and so often. Bottled oxygen does not make a person immortal up there, but it buys time and clarity, the two things most likely to get a struggling climber back down alive. The one thing Dean and Delia had refused on principle. There is a bitter symmetry to it. The single thing the couple had built their whole argument around refusing was the thing most likely to have carried them down alive, and they had intentionally carried no supplemental oxygen at all and no backup for the descent. The symptoms the other climbers described were consistent with severe hypoxia and possibly high-altitude cerebral edema. But without any real medical assessment high on the mountain, no one could ever say exactly where exhaustion ended and altitude illness began. It is not a dramatic way to be taken, which is part of why it is so often underestimated by exactly the sort of strong, capable people most likely to try what these two tried. Pride and courage can look identical from the outside, especially up there, and I still cannot tell you with certainty which of the two carried these two past the point where the mountain lets you turn back. It has to be said plainly that no one was beside them at the very end, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What is known was reconstructed afterward from a handful of honest sources, from Chiring's account of where and when he last saw them alive and the state they were in, from the other climbers who passed the couple on the descent and stopped to help, from the timestamps and the footage on their own recovered cameras, from the radio calls that went back and forth to the high camp that afternoon, and from the places on the mountain where the two of them were later found. What no one can tell you, and what this channel will not pretend to know, is what Dean or Delia were thinking as the light went out of that day, or what passed between a husband and wife in their last hours on the roof of the world, because none of that was recorded and none of it came back down. Dean and Delia Ridley died high on Mount Everest, on the descent from the summit they had just reached, most likely late that afternoon and into the freezing night, of the combined effects of extreme altitude, exhaustion, and cold. They were found afterward on the high slopes below the top, close together, both still clipped to the fixed line, the way the route holds everyone. Chiring survived, and got himself down through the dark to the high camp, frostbitten and hollowed out, and carrying a weight that was never his to carry. Almost everything anyone knows of their final hours is known only because he lived to tell it, and because so many other climbers strung along that same route saw pieces of the end. They were not taken by a fall, or a storm, or a mistake on the technical ground they had mastered decades before, the kind of dramatic end the mountains are famous for. They were taken by the one thing on that mountain their skill could not touch, the simple, patient lack of air, the same quiet killer the veterans had warned them about in the plainest words they had, and they were taken, in the end, by a certainty that had told them right to the summit that the people trying to warn them were simply the ones who did not understand the mountain the way they did. The argument they had come to settle did not end the way anyone would have wanted, and it did not make heroes or villains of anyone. Kurt Rustad, the veteran they had mocked by name, refused every invitation to say he had told them so, and by all accounts grieved two climbers he had truly admired even as they insulted him, saying only that the mountain had made the point he could not. Chiring went back to work on Everest the very next season, because it is what he does and how he feeds his family, and the other Sherpas spoke of him quietly, and with real respect for staying as long as he did on that slope. In the climbing world, the old debate flared up again, about oxygen and fair means, and what is owed to the people who make the mountain possible, sharper this time, because two of the most gifted voices on one side of it were gone. The footage the couple had made became something they never intended, passed around not as the manifesto they meant it to be, but as a warning, and their friends have mostly asked that it be left alone. What almost no one did, to the credit of that world, was celebrate being proven right. The people who had warned them took no pleasure in it, having all lost friends to the same thin air and knowing there was nothing to win. If anything, the loss of two climbers that gifted made the veterans push their message harder, that the mountain is not an opinion to be argued with, and that respect for it is not weakness. Within Nepal's guiding community, it was quietly noted that the couple had broken no rule anyone could point to, that choosing to climb without oxygen is entirely legal and entirely a person's own risk to take, and that this was precisely precisely the problem, because the mountain enforces its own rules long after the human ones run out. Turing gave up the emergency oxygen his team was carrying to people who had spent 2 years calling men like him hired help, and I do not think I will ever let that leave my mind. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without making Dean and Delia into a punchline, because it would be easy and it would be wrong. They were extraordinary at the thing they had given their lives to, and being extraordinary at one thing had quietly convinced them they could not be badly wrong about another, which is a trap that has nothing to do with mountains and catches almost all of us eventually. The veterans they mocked were not small men guarding a business. They were people who had learned the hard way, and over many years, exactly where that mountain stops caring how good you are, and were trying to say so to two people who had decided in advance not to hear it. There is no villain in this story, only two brilliant, stubborn people who mistook their mastery of the climbing for mastery of the mountain, and a quiet Sherpa who tried to save them with the very thing they had refused. The mountain did not hate them, and it did not respect them either. It simply does not grade on skill, and it never has, and it never will. Something in that last summit clip stays with me. Two people truly happy on top of the world, and I wish I could reach into it and tell them that the hard part was not behind them at all. I do not tell this story to sneer at two people who can no longer answer, because there is nothing to be gained in that, and because the warning in it belongs to all of us, and not just to climbers. Almost every one of us is an expert at something, and quietly believes that being right so often in that one place means the ordinary rules bend for us everywhere else. Everest is one of the last honest things left. A place that takes your genuine brilliance and your years of earned confidence and hands them right back, unimpressed, along with the same terms it offers the tourist and the legend alike, which are oxygen and time or nothing. That is the quiet, uncomfortable lesson under this one. That competence is not the same as wisdom, and that the more certain we are, the less we tend to listen to the people who have already paid for the knowledge we are about to buy. Dean and Delia Ridley were told by people who had every reason to know and no reason to lie that the mountain does not bend for anyone. They climbed toward it certain that it would bend for them, and it let them believe that right up the final ridge and onto the summit, and not one single step further than that,